Today's guest is Ibrahim Khan, co-founder of Cur8 Capital, an Islamic finance guru. Ibrahim is widely regarded as a leader in the Islamic finance industry, having swapped a career in big law for entrepreneurship, driven by a mission to financially uplift communities.
In this episode, Ibrahim talks us through his upbringing in the Midlands, studying PPE at Oxford, and his career as a lawyer with city law firm Ashurst.
We then focus in on his entrepreneurial journey, from an educational blog to a groundbreaking Sharia-compliant venture capital fund, Cur8.
Welcome, Ibrahim, to the Leadership Unplugged podcast. Thank you for having us and taking time out of your day to sit down and speak with us. We always start every podcast with a different question, but I want to start off with this one, which is, in order to best understand who Ibrahim Khan is, what do the listeners need to know about you?
I think if you want to understand a person, you probably want to think about where they came from, their background, their story. That helps contextualize how they think about the world, and then also what they're doing right now, because often a big portion of our identity is tied up with what we do. And then I'd say the final thing is why they do what they do. So taking each of those in turn, I'd say, so like by way of background, I grew up in the northeast of England, middle class parents, very practicing family. My mum always, pushed me into doing some, stuff for the Muslim community. That was kind of a big emphasis, which I guess, still informs the why today as well. And so, what I do today is helping, Muslims hopefully level up financially and, making returns and making them in a halal way, but also hopefully in an impactful way as well. So yeah, that's how I think about it.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think you've covered the why as well in the introductory question, which is good to understand. Why don't we go back to kind of your journey somewhat to how you've got here? And you mentioned kind of your upbringing and your early life. If we maybe flick forward to university, going to Oxford, why don't you tell us a little bit about that journey, kind of why you want to study what you did, what the challenges you had on the way, and how you went about that?
Yeah, I read a book called Who Runs This Place? And it was by some journalist. And in it, I was looking through it, and there's like the civil service, banks, academia. And then one of the chapters was around university, and it appeared that pretty much anyone who had done anything in politics in particular, but across all sorts of professions, had done this one degree called PPE, and particularly done it at Oxford. So I thought, all right, okay, well, if we're going to, improve the Muslim community's position in the world, clearly I should be thinking about something like that. And PPE's philosophy, politics, and economics. And so that was the core motivation to doing it. And I thought, in terms of, so at Oxford, you've got different colleges where you can apply to. And the college that I went for was Brasenose College, which is David Cameron's old college. Mm-hmm. And so David Cameron is obviously ex-Prime Minister. He also did PPE. Yeah. So I thought, if I'm going to do something, I might as well try and do that. And alhamdulillah, I got, I think, quite lucky, but also I think it was possibly somewhat strategic. I think mainly lucky, in that the tutor that interviewed me, he had, I think the year before or 6 months before, done this open program at access program that Oxbridge and Russell Group universities do up in Newcastle. And so I just asked him, what's the book that I should read if I'm going to be applying for PPE? And he said, read this one book, Anarchy, State and Utopia by Robert Nozick, which I did. I didn't understand most of it. And then I read it again. I understood probably even less. And then it just mainly by chance, it turned out he was the tutor who was interviewing me. Mm-hmm. So that was, I think, quite nice. And then I think that my time at Oxford was fantastic. Like, it was, you're surrounded by very bright people, half of whom are from private school. So, there's that aspect to it as well. But you also, you're getting pushed, and you're having deep, complicated conversations until like 3 a.m. in the morning. It was like very normal to be discussing about, what is jurisprudence and the rule of law and various things like that. at 2 or 3 in the morning, at least in my my group of friends. And at the same time, it was very normal to be playing, cricket in the flat at 1 a.m. in the morning as well.
All right.
So it was that full spectrum. But yeah, I really enjoyed it.
So I actually did PPE as well.
Okay, nice.
But at King's
Nice.
in London rather than Oxford. I think I had a similar kind of interest in it. I read another book by Jonathan Wolfe called, I think, An Introduction to Philosophy, Politics and Economics. And I absolutely loved history and economics growing up. So it felt like for me, I had no idea what I wanted to do as a career, but I knew what I wanted to study. And I generally really enjoyed, I think at heart, I am an academic. I really, like you said, kind of just debating those big ideas, those complex ideas about how society functions, about the foundations of knowledge, kind of really appealed to me.
I mean, yes, completely different to you guys. I didn't go to university at all. So I joined PwC at 18 in the tax division. The motivations behind that were kind of, I just wanted to get started, and I'm quite a practical person naturally. I would say I'm all right academically, but I'm definitely not the brightest person in the room. I'm more of a doer and a hands-on guy, and going to PwC was such a big step from where I was at 18 years old. I learned so much, even in my first 2-3 months there. But it really kind of reaffirmed my belief that the practical route was kind of the better route for me, and later down the line I ended up using that practicality and those skills to have an impact in my own way. One thing I wanted to touch based on in your time at Oxford was, obviously you learned so much at Oxford, both academically, as a person, pastorally, etc. What's kind of like that one thing which you feel like you learned at Oxford, or a skill that you developed at Oxford, which is so core and important to you as a leader today?
I'd say that the willingness to just throw yourself into the deep end and give things a bit of a go, and I think also trusting that you will be able to lead a group without as long as you're clear on why you're doing the thing, and as long as you're passionate about the thing. So the context here is I did a lot of plays at university, including an ISOC play, and there, as long as you've got an idea, you've got a script, and you've got a rough understanding of what needs to be done. Once you get the ball rolling, things kind of fall into place, and one thing leads to another. I think Oxford made me understand that networks are really important, and being able to turn to people for advice on, the next step in your journey that you perhaps have not encountered yet, whether that's, going from first year into second year to third year to graduation. There's always people slightly ahead of you that you can turn to. And university is that probably the last stage where your middle class person, he has his trajectory set out from him from the moment he is born. He goes to a secondary school, probably a private school. He does his 11 plus, he does his GCSEs, A levels. He goes to a Russell Group university, if he can, goes to Oxbridge, and then he goes to Goldman Sachs or PwC in your case, or wherever, spends a few years there, and then finally that's the kind of end of the road, and he has to kind of make his mind up. But some people make their mind up at university, and so there's that optionality that starts creeping in there, and I think talking to people a bit further on in the journey can be quite helpful for that.
How did you approach that? Kind of what was your journey at that stage once you did PPE? Kind of what conversations were you having? What were your ideas, and what did you actually choose to do next?
So I sat down, first principles, thought about what do I want to achieve in my life? What am I good at? What is there a need for in the world? What does the Muslim community need? And create those just Venn diagrams and just look for the overlap. I subsequently found that there's a thing called Ikigai, and I think that I came up with it independently. so that was quite interesting, just doing that analysis, and I where I came down was that I want to do something in Islamic finance, I'm interested in investment, entrepreneurship even at that time, and I was doing stuff even at that time, and I'm interested, of course, in Islamic law and Islam generally. So, is there a way to combine the two things? And it seems to be, Islamic finance is that route. But in order to get into Islamic finance, my sense is that, the best people combine both the conventional and the Islamic, at least knowledge base and experience base. And so that looked like in practice, doing a master's straight out of uni in Islamic finance, starting my alim course, so the traditional route as well. And then I applied immediately after university for law. And the thinking was that law would be a good stepping stone into learning about Islamic finance from a corporate perspective. And if it doesn't work out, there's options out as well. And so, I applied to Ashurst, which was the first and only ever application I made. It was the only place open at the time. And I got in, I got lucky, and then that was it. I was on that path after that.
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned that you kind of entered the world of corporate law. I wanted to ask, obviously there's going to be a lot of listeners that maybe are students or have maybe just started their career in corporate law. You were embarking on that journey. Did you have any expectations in your head as to like what the industry would be like, or maybe what you would learn, and how did reality kind of match up to those expectations?
So my expectation was that it would be similar to Suits, and in many ways it was, but the bit where in the background you've got people working, that's what it was. But no, it was a really good experience. It has everything I learned as a lawyer, I use often today, even if I don't want to. So I did, seat in litigation first, and that's really helpful whenever there's some kind of dispute. I did a seat in banking and finance, which is very helpful as well because we deal with Islamic finance all the time, and it's the same documentation. I did a seat in regulation, financial regulation, and as a regulated entity, that is mega helpful. And then I did a seat in funds formation, and I specialized in funds, which is what we do today. We run, funds, which is again completely relevant. So in a fortuitous way, it kind of everything I did actually ended up being useful for what I do today. And my experience of law, though, is that most lawyers are not really cut out for entrepreneurship. And right. They're a certain breed of person. They're quite cautious. They're quite, academic. They're quite, detail oriented, which is perhaps why I'm not a lawyer anymore. And I think that, in a place in the corporate space where you're working as a lawyer, especially as a junior, I think a lot of the time you kind of you don't really have that much flex in terms of what you can achieve from a like a corporate, like a professional perspective. That there are just processes that you have to get through, and then the fun stuff happens when you're a senior associate or a partner. But you can do a whole bunch of other stuff on the side. So whilst I was in my training contract at Ashurst, I set up something called the IRU, the Islamophobia Response Unit, which is now a charity that spun out from MEND, and they help thousands of people around who've been victims of hate crime or discrimination. And we've got volunteer law firms such as Ashurst and others like Simmons & Simmons who give their pro bono time to help these people who've been victims. And so that whole thing was just spun up in the first year and a half of me being a trainee, which was, I think, quite helpful. I'm now a trustee of that charity many years later. And so I think when you're probably the same thing with you guys at PwC, when you're in junior, you have a little bit more bandwidth, and you can do other interesting extracurricular stuff, which can become very relevant and very useful for your wider development as well.
It seems like, speaking to you, everything was somewhat planned out, but actually a lot of it maybe just fell into the right place at the right time. Well, if you put yourself kind of back in those shoes at that moment in time, did you have that feeling of uncertainty, and then do you just trust that it would all fit in eventually, looking back, or would you say everything was very meticulously planned as much as it could be?
So I'm definitely a planner, but I'm also someone who doesn't fill in all the details, if that makes sense. I like lean or incline towards action rather than like stasis, and so every 6 months or so I would have like a clear game plan in terms of like, okay, this is where I'm at. I do this, like that ikigai thing again. I do that regularly, and you you have a pathway that you're pointing towards from where you are at that particular point, and so there was always a propulsion behind my actions and motivations, and some of those things work out, others don't, but whatever works out, ultimately there was a plan to it, right? So there's always a thread that kind of weaves its way through. So for example, in my training contract, I also spent the first year all of my holidays doing mini pupilages to barristers' chambers, unbeknownst to anyone at Ashurst. And that was, and then ultimately that didn't work out. So like in my second year, I went through the bar interviews and all of that stuff, and I got through to a few final rounds, but then ultimately it didn't work out, and so there was a concerted effort, a quiet, concerted, secret effort for like a year and a bit behind that, but that didn't happen, and that's qadar Allah. I was like, okay, either I go into the bar or I go into funds, and so that pathway seemed to open up quite nicely. And straight out of Ashurst, Ashurst asked me to stay on, but I decided to go to DevVoice because it's better for funds, also pays more money, and I realized that I was going to leave corporate law, in the near future, so it just made sense to get enough money together for a deposit.
Okay, you talk about kind of knowing that you're going to leave corporate law. Now, kind of to an outsider, degree from Oxford, kind of a prestigious law firm, kind of career set out ahead of you. What was it that made you kind of make that decision that you want to go down the path of entrepreneurship rather than continuing in this career?
So I knew that I was going to leave Ashurst before I even went in, and corporate law full stop, because it's I think to most people, or just a bunch of people, I think entrepreneurship is just like an innate part of who they are. And I was someone who as a kid was importing in cricket bats from Pakistan and selling them, and my dad used to get free pens from his urology conferences, which had like these floating plastic sperm in them, and so that developed a black market in the school for stuff like that. And then he also used to get Viagra pens. So Viagra is like a big thing in urology, right? And so you get these sponsored pens. So again, market for that stuff. And we did lots of other things after that as well. So it was always like there was always that itch. There was always that something going on that was kind of commercial on the side. And I knew that very quickly. Even after entering law, I'd done some, vacation schemes and stuff, so I had a sense of what law was like. I knew that this was a stepping stone to something, as opposed to the end goal in itself. And it was just a case of, and I think it was actually quite well thought out, even in my 20s, that, I'm tooling up for something. I don't know what it was exactly, but I knew it was in something to do with finance, something to do with Islamic finance, investment, the community. Those are the kind of themes that have knitted everything together in my 20s. And then it kind of, ultimately became Islamic Finance Guru. And by the way, Islamic Finance Guru was started off as a blog, as a side hobby back in 2015, 2016. Throughout, this time, I was blogging away. And so it was, all of these things kind of are interrelated. I think that, the helpful take-home message for someone listening who's trying to, figure out their path is figure out what you're passionate about and figure out what you really care about and start doing stuff in that space that actually has an output. So I'm passionate about, the Muslim community, Islamophobia. So, the IRU is a thing that ultimately got created, or I'm passionate about finance, investment, and, talking about that. And Islamic Finance Guru was the output there. So yeah, thinking of it from that respect, I think is quite helpful. And then just sticking at things for long periods of time, if something will happen.
Yeah, I think that's super useful, like that somewhat formula that you've just given us, because I think a lot of people will kind of not necessarily be lost, but they'll be thinking about what's the next step, and kind of having that time to yourself, like the ikigai, doing that regularly, creating that path and actually actioning that's super important. I wanted to also talk about entrepreneurship in a little bit more detail, especially around the idea of choosing to go down that route, because a lot of the time when we look at founders or founders that are idolized to a certain extent, it's always focused on the individual, not necessarily the support network around the individual. So when you kind of embarked on IFG and you made it your full-time thing, how did your support network kind of react to that? Were they quite supportive? Were there some people that told you, you probably shouldn't go down this route? And ultimately, kind of what made you make that decision?
My wife, I was married at the time, I had a child. My wife was very supportive, and she just trusted that I would know what I'm doing, and I think I had given her good reason to believe that, right? Because I even when I got married, I paid for my own wedding by the year before, just kind of whilst I was studying, also like doing tuition and various things. So I was like, historically I had a track record in trying to be as independent and like self-sufficient as possible. And then my parents were pretty supportive as well. I think they were, they did quietly say that, I'm not sure that this is, why don't you do a few more years and then go in? And it does seem like a bit of a leap. But at the same time, they were supportive. It wasn't like, no, don't do it, or this is like really scary. It was like, if you thought about this, maybe it's better to just, not do it. But they trusted, me and my decision. And also I think the decision itself was quite well thought out, kind of sensibly, in the sense that, we said in early 2019, me and my co-founder Mohsin, that we want to leave by end of 2020. December 2020 is when we're going to be, leaving. As it happened like, in 9 months' time rather than 24 months' time. And the key, trigger points were that IFG started making money, enough money for us to survive on its own. We also then raised £250,000 as angel money, which gives a massive buffer. And then Mohsin quit September, October time. I waited until my bonus in December and then quit. And that was quite key for me, because the final piece of the puzzle is that, that then allowed me to put down my deposit for my house, for my Islamic mortgage. And that, takes your monthly expenditure, your rent, down to something pretty affordable. And then I set the mortgage for 30 years or 35 years rather than the usual 20, 25 years, simply because I wanted to have as low a payment rate as possible. And so for all of those reasons, it wasn't too much of a stretch. The other thing is that when we left, from a salary perspective, it was a pretty decent, reduction. It was like, I think, a third or less of what we were, like what I was on in particular. And I think that, to be honest, that didn't really affect me too much, because most of the additional cash was already going towards a deposit anyway. And now that had been achieved, so it kind of made it sustainable. So yeah, I think the journey into entrepreneurship there was a strong degree of inevitability, at least in our case. Like, it wasn't like, oh, I want to like idealistically be an entrepreneur. It is like, no, I just kind of need to do this. And then the family was supportive, and I think there was a thoughtful process around how to do it as well.
Just wanted to ask you, maybe on this transitionary period, two further questions. The first is, you mentioned that now looking back at your time in corporate law, a lot of the things that you learned are still eminently useful to you. And you also mentioned that your parents were kind of saying, maybe do a couple of more years. So in terms of finding that balance between getting the most out of your initial years and the experience you have in your current role versus kind of making that jump early enough, how do you go about making that decision in the right way?
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this, and I don't know. Out of everything that I've said, I think there's a fair degree of planning, but choice of seats is not something that you really have a full control. Like if I had my choice, I probably wouldn't do banking and finance, but it turned out to be very useful. And so I think that there's an element of that. I've completely forgotten the question.
I guess finding the right time.
The right time.
Transition.
So I would suggest that if you're in corporate law to pick up a skill set, that you should have at least a year or two of that skill set. Probably 2 years is ideal for that skill set to properly bed in. You won't be a master of that skill set at that point, but you will have, 75% of the knowledge, and you will have 100% of the lie of the land. If you're like I don't know, to use the funds analogy. So I was a funds lawyer, and as a funds lawyer now, I'm not by any means like a partner level or senior associate level where I could, hold the pen on a complex LPA and structuring and do it all by myself. But I know more than enough to be dangerous. I know how it all works, and I can go to the right people to make it all work. So, and I think that comes with about 2 years of experience. Now, if you want to do a bit more, it's no problem. 4, 6, 8 years, that's cool as well. It will open up new doors. But it will also, reduce your time to do something.
Okay. One follow-up is you mentioned there was this almost kind of positive driving force for you kind of leaving law, that you knew from the outset that at heart you were an entrepreneur. Were there any kind of negative drivers as well in terms of being in your environment? Were you doing or were you having to do anything which kind of maybe didn't align with your values? And if so, for young people who feel that they're trapped in a system, it doesn't align with their belief system or their value systems, what advice would you have?
So I didn't really enjoy my time in banking because of that reason, but that was 6 months, and and then after that, I think I was pretty happy with what I was doing in funds. I think when it comes to the long hours, that was the negative motivation, right? Where you don't particularly enjoy coming in at home at like 2 a.m. in the morning or something. And, there's something wrong if there are sleeping pods in an office. That's problem. Although I say that, Mohsin actually has some sleeping stuff here as well. So. But none of our team have taken him up on this, idea that they join him sleeping in the office. So yeah, I think that negative aspect is can be quite motivating. But I think if you have like a silver lining, you can get through this stuff as well. So I would make it a point that, when I'm like 11 p.m. at night or even at 12 or midnight, I would do some IFG work at that point, because, that's your way out, right? So you have to put in the hard yards at that point. I remember a funny story where I came in after having done like all day Sunday work, and my roommate, a guy called Zhao, he was a very hardworking guy from America, Chinese background, and he was sat there, and I was like, okay, look, I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna tell him, just let the office know that I've done some work on a Sunday, and so I came in, and he's normally in a tie and a suit and stuff, and he was kind of sat there in his just casual wear, so I was like, oh. So I told him I'd been working on Sunday. So I was like, oh, but, when did you come in? And he was like, Saturday evening, I think he said. And he's basically not left since that time until today. And I was like, all right, fine. At this point, I kind of, hold my hand up and say, I'm never going to be able to work as hard as you.
I mean, so like after your career in law, you obviously set up Islamic Finance Guru and then Cur8 Capital later on. Whenever I've worked on startups or with startups, I always tell founders or myself that a startup it's a continuation of iteration, just a story of iteration. You just keep changing. You have that feedback loop. Use that feedback to improve your product. What I wanted to understand when you were kind of setting up IFG and maybe Cur8 a little bit later, was there one particular instance or feedback that you got was particularly negative, and you took that and then changed the product? How did that make you feel, and how important do you think it is to have that continuous change and iteration, especially in the startup setting?
I think that startups very much are, and all businesses very much are, this ocean of negotiation between human problems and human solutions, and trying to find a match between those two things. And like humans evolve over time, I think businesses that are successful will also evolve over time. And I think startups in particular are businesses who will evolve much more so than your traditional businesses. So let's take, a business like, I don't know, Rolls-Royce, and let's take a business like Google. Now, Rolls-Royce was selling, transportation at heart, and it still does in many ways, shapes and forms. And even Rolls-Royce has evolved so much as a business, right? I mean, you guys probably know that it doesn't own the car brand anymore. Mm-hmm. It's actually just an engine manufacturer, and it's actually much more focused around like industrial uses of that engine. And that's what evolved, that's a natural evolution that's happened for Rolls-Royce over time. But Rolls-Royce had a clear playbook, like we are creating technology, engineering and kind of mechanical technology, and we are packaging that up and we're selling that. With a startup like Google, they didn't have a business model. They just had this, algorithmic kind of, search algorithm technology, and it seemed to be quite useful, but they didn't have a way of monetizing that. And so they tried a few different, I think, strategies before they hit upon this auction-led search, advertising thing that they do today. And startups do that, right? So there's many startups will evolve and try many, many different things before they ultimately hit upon that business model that works. And it's the same with IFG, right? When we started in 2019, when we set out on the path to leaving and going full time, the first thing we did was a video course, an online video course. And then the second thing we did was, I think, wills. And then we did that affiliate marketing type stuff, referrals and things like that. And then we did this angel syndicate that was happening as well in the same time. And then we've had a bunch of other things as well that we've tried, and some of them have failed. And so I think that all business is some kind of negotiation. And then in terms of negative feedback, I think that the thing that we see startup founders like messing up on, because Cur8 Capital is this weird thing where we are a startup, but we also invest in lots of startups. So the thing that, the worst thing that you can do as a startup founder is to be too like rigid in terms of what you think works and what is right, or is being too arrogant to be able to take feedback, and to just, don't be like too sensitive around negative feedback. Like I really like it if people give negative feedback, because it takes a level of courage to give negative feedback to someone, especially in person. So if someone is doing that, then that means that there's hundreds of other silent participants who feel that same thing. They just haven't articulated it to you. And so I think negative feedback is really important to develop. And, for us, multiple people gave, negative feedback that, you need to be more focused on a particular thing. And so ultimately, that has evolved till today, where it's basically just Cur8 Capital. That's our business model, so to speak. So I think negative feedback is vital.
Now, you're someone who's kind of moved into what people would traditionally see as a leadership role, kind of starting a startup and then employing others quite early in your life. And what would you say, what kind of leader do you think would you describe yourself as? And what kind of leader do you think you want to be? And how do you see that journey?
It's probably a question for my team, I think. I think I would describe myself as, the kind of leader I would like to be is someone who has a passion for what we're working on, and leads by example and shows the level of dedication and effort and attention to detail and craft that we should put into our work. And I think leadership is also about having the raw ingredients to do the leadership type work, so strategy and hiring and motivating people. That is actual core material that you need to do as a leader. And then I think where I probably personally I think fall short is around the ongoing personal kind of relationship or coaching of our team. I think we do that, and I do that as well, but I think that's where I could probably do better, I think. And because I'm naturally more interested in the whole strategy stuff, for example, and I think that's this aspect, the one-to-one, man-to-man aspect, coaching, is also crucial. I think Mohsin is actually pretty good at that. So yeah, that's kind of I think how I would think of myself as a leader. Like if you have a few different types of leader. I think you've got people who are more kind of sales oriented, a bit more, I don't know, polished or front facing, whatever you want to call it, the Harvey Specters of the world, right? Mm-hmm. In suits. Then you've got the Lewis Litts of the world who are the machines who just they know their stuff and they're very technical and deep like that. And then you've got, I think, the operators who just kind of make things happen and knit everything together. I actually don't know what the suits equivalent of that would be, but that kind of role. And out of those three, I think you as a leader, you need to have all three of those abilities. I think instinctively I incline more towards the first, like the front-facing bit, and a little bit on the technical bit. I'm not so I can do, and I do often do some of the operational stuff, but that is probably less my forte.
I think I just wanted to actually mention your co-founder Mohsin, because at the end he leads the business with you. He's very much very hands-on in IFG and Cur8 as well. How did you meet Mohsin, and kind of what's the story behind that, and what made you think that this would be a good person to start a business with?
I met Mohsin at an ISOT barbecue in 2011. So we only actually spent 1 year at university together, but we after the ISOT barbecue we just hung out, and he ended up at my flat or my room, and then we hung out a bit more, and then the friendship just naturally deepened, and most evenings we would have dinner together where he would cook, and he was limited cook, but he was better than me. He'd make pasta, and then I would do the washing up. Okay. And this was a common thing, that this is the person that I would have dinner with mostly. So, and then we just kept in touch after university as well, right? And we were just ongoing conversations and ideating and doing stuff together. And so and then we did this beard oil called Skinsation for a while. So that was our first. No, we actually did a play together as well where we bankrolled it.
Nice.
So that was our first thing, and then the second thing was Skinsation, and then we did this law consultancy type thing, citylawyer.com or something, which didn't really work out. And then IFG was a joint project as well, and then eventually it became what it is. So yeah, things that have evolved over time.
It started off at the barbecue, and it is what it is now.
Yeah, exactly.
You spoke about wanting to inculcate those skills of mentorship as a leader. How important has mentorship been to you as an individual, and how have you sought out mentors and kind of built your relationships with them?
I like to. I think I could probably lean more on mentors, but I think the people that I really respect from just a decision-making perspective in terms of like, how they navigate a business, situation, or how they approach things. That's those people I stick close to, and I would end up normally having like an ongoing conversation with them, or like even like a business relationship with some of those people in some way, shape, or form. Like in the startup world, you give a little bit of advisory equity and you get them on to your advisory board, and so that happens, right? And our advisory board, we've got Sultan, who's the ex-CEO of Al Rayyan Bank, and so I was actually on a call with him earlier today around like business that we'll be doing together, right? And then Eamon is the co-founder of Onfido, good friend from university. And so I would, seek out his advice on lots of things, but we're investors in his company, for example, now as well. And there's other people that I'm inspired by more from like a, decision, more from like an ethics perspective, like having a good gut instinct on things that are right and wrong. I would say people like Mufti Faraz is a good example, Mufti Faraz Adam. And I would say that, my wife has given some really fantastic advice on this as well. So I think, like, what is mentoring? Mentoring is, for someone to know the space a little bit better than you and guide you through that, and also know you to some extent and help you, vis-a-vis your pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses, navigate a space. And I think mentors are in some way friends and your kind of group of acquaintances. So, we will be raised on the day of judgment, it is said, in the hadith, about how with the people that we are normally frequenting. So if you can, spend your time frequenting, those people that you are inspired by, that I think naturally has an uplifting effect on everything, but including your let's say your leadership.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. It seems like, to a certain extent, you kind of seek out these mentors, but then also when the time is right, they find you to a certain extent as well.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of touch a little bit. We spoke about team dynamics a little bit earlier, and this idea of actually ideation itself, because in my experience, kind of ideas, they're very fragile things. Like we don't really know when they will come, whether or not they'll be good or bad. And I wanted to understand, like, as a leader, especially at IFG, how do you kind of foster a good culture of ideation, and how important is it to you guys as a firm?
I think when a young graduate comes in at IFG for the first time, the thing that they're like often most struck by is just how much slack they have to do whatever they want. Because from my perspective, if you can give someone ownership over something, that's when the ideas really start flowing. And we're not particularly interested in doing that person's job. That's why he's there or she's there, and we want them to do as much as they possibly can do. And the only way that you find that out is by just saying, just telling them to do stuff, or giving them a rough, sketch, and then off you go. And then they will hit their own barriers, and then you kind of adjust, and then you kind of unlock those, and then they can go further. Mm-hmm. So I think ownership has a really strong link with ideation. We regularly have group sessions where we will ideate around certain points, certain things, because I think the communal dialectic between different people can bring out lots of interesting ideas. And then I think, a good idea is only as good as it, performs, mm-hmm. right? It can sound quite good, but, in execution, it depends. So I think having this culture of loads of ideas and loads of potential experiments, but then actually running them and then being data-led about, what actually works or not, is something that at least we're trying to, get to.
Interesting. I have a question, more of a personal question. In terms of setting your intentions, it seems like you've done a lot and you do a lot of different things, and it can often be easy to get caught up in the detail and the day-to-day of what you're doing. How do you go about setting your intentions and your underlying why and your reasoning, and kind of reaffirming and sticking to those intentions?
I think with Islamic, I mean, at this point in time, I don't really do the Ikigai stuff because, IFG is all kind of consuming. There's no point doing it. Like, I know this is the thing. I see it as my, life's work. And I'd say that with, with your intention, you want to build in, systems into your life or into your daily living that keep your intentions in the right track. So if you asked anyone in the IFG team what is the mission for IFG, they would actually tell you it's to help Muslims level up financially. And I've tried it multiple times. Like I will, there might be a meeting going on with someone outside of the team, and I'll just randomly ask one of the members of our team to, tell them about what the mission is at IFG. And so we're very aligned to that, and ultimately decisions come back to that constantly. So that, I think, really helps, clarify the intention. I think doing like regular dua and having that kind of relationship with God can be really powerful in, clarifying your intentions and, having regular dua, formulations that you do with respect to, what you're doing, let's say it's at IFG, and your end goal can be very powerful. So like there are specific du'as that I will do pretty much every day around, how we want IFG, to be an enabler to help Muslims level up and, to do X, Y, and Z. And so you're, when you're saying that, and this is probably the first time I've ever even shared it with someone, right? So when you say that regularly to the Almighty, that I think probably has some level of impact somewhere.
So we've talked about the intentions and reaffirming your kind of almost the driving force and the driving factor. Now, when you look at trying to translate that into outcomes, are you someone who sets goals based on outputs or based on inputs?
What do you mean by that? Can you give me an example?
It means it's something that I've personally been struggling with a little bit. I feel like throughout my kind of education, professional life so far, I've had specific goals or outcomes I want to achieve. Like I want to land X role, I want to do X many deals in a year type of thing. Whereas I feel like that at some point becomes unsustainable, and I feel like I've been neglecting building habits or building goals based on my inputs and my actual efforts that I'm going to do. I'm going to set X amount of time per day to do X, Y, and Z type of things.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a bit of both really probably makes most sense. I don't know, have you come across like OKRs?
No.
Like objective and key results.
It rings a bell, but I've not really read into it in detail.
So so it's like a thing that is quite common in the tech sector. It's like, KPIs basically.
Yeah.
Where you set like a high level objective and then you set key results that are quite numeric. And the key results, you ideally want them to be things that are difficult to achieve, but are in your control. And so these are more, they are ultimately trying to move a wider, KPI that you don't really have direct control of. Mm-hmm. But the things that you're doing to get there, you do have direct control of. So if you're trying to increase, AUM, mm-hmm. one of the ways might be to, you need to have this many deals on the platform, over the next quarter. So you set yourself an ambitious target, and then you try and aim to get at least 70% of that done. And that you have pretty direct control over that. Whereas you don't necessarily know how investors are going to respond to that. But that's one of the causal factors to a larger AUM. So I'd say that. And then I'd say that in my personal life, I don't think I ever really set myself, outcome-oriented goal. Well, I guess, to some extent you do. Like, I want to get this job or something like that. But in the main, the kind of output, the kind of goals I would set myself is like doing something consistently over a period of time. Mm-hmm. And I often fail in that. But yeah, in my personal life, I think I would probably be a bit more input-oriented. And in the professional life, it would be a mixture of both.
I just wanted to kind of touch on the idea of being a founder. We've been speaking to previous guests, and something which kind of was drawn out of that and something which I picked up on was I think people underestimate how lonely it can be being a founder sometimes. And I wanted to ask, obviously you've got your co-founder Mohsin, who probably helps quite a lot in that regard. But have you ever felt that loneliness or that isolation, and how have you dealt with it and kind of moved on from it?
I think Mohsin being around is very helpful, because me and him are in it together, so you can have that conversation. I think to some extent, there's that saying, right? It's lonely at the top. Mm-hmm. In a sense, that is true, because necessarily there's like a pyramid usually structure in organizations, and and at the top there's just less people by nature of the shape of a pyramid. So I think the way that you deal with that is by talking to people outside who are perhaps at the top of their pyramids, mm-hmm. and get their context and their advice about various things, and then feed that back into where you are. Yeah.
Is that how you would probably advise the startups that you guys invested in via Cur8 or angel invested? Because like you mentioned, you have a co-founder, Mohsin, but a lot of the companies you might have invested in might have single founders who might not necessarily be struggling with it, but have that reality around them. Is that what you'd kind of advise them, is try and speak to others that are in a similar position?
I think most of our companies actually have multiple founders, because I think it's a good signal for success, because being a single startup founder is very hard. It's not, I don't think it's easily sustainable. Mm-hmm. But even as a multi-team, co-founding team, it can still be quite hard, right? And I think doing things like regular get-togethers with other startup founders is quite a good way of dealing with that. And that we've often done that. So we regularly will meet up with other startup founders and just have that relationship going, because it's not you can't have a conversation with your team about sensitive topics that you perhaps can do with another startup founder. Mm-hmm. You can't have a conversation about hiring and firing with your team necessarily, but you can with another founder.
Yeah. I wanted to touch on the concept of building a legacy. So it was actually one of the lessons in the Islamic finance course where Mufti Faraz is talking about the legacy of Imam Bukhari, and how it's important to want to build a legacy for after we leave. And I was just wondering, is this something you think about? You're building an institution which you are kind of leading to an extent at the moment. How do you think about your legacy longer term after you're gone, and what sort of things are you doing now to kind of prepare for that?
I probably am too young, I think, to think actively about my legacy, but I would like to think that if we can be the catalyst for the Muslim community getting back to a level playing field, and then perhaps even overtaking and becoming leaders in the world, I think that would be something that I'd be happy with. And in terms of like legacy, it's what matters most in the court of God is not necessarily how much other people know you. It's that what did you actually do. So for me, my legacy is like real impact. Like, what did you actually achieve vis-a-vis this particular goal? That's how I think about it. And it's a goal that I think will take me at least. It'll probably take it's a goal that you can spend the rest of your life on, and you've only just put in the groundwork for the next 50, 100 years for it to come to fruition. So yeah, that's how I would judge my legacy.
So IFG plays a kind of educational role to an extent, of kind of educating people about Islamic finance concept. How do you navigate different viewpoints when it comes to things like Islamic finance, or more generally, and kind of striking a balance between formulating your own view but still being open and broad-minded?
I think there's certain views out there that are just really out there to the point where they're just obviously wrong, and I don't think giving time or airspace to those kind of views makes sense. But then I think that there's other views that reasonable people can disagree over. And I think those views it is important in our role at Islamic Finance Guru, where we're looking to cover the broader market, that we try and at least give a sketch of other perspectives. And then I think our role is to give our perspective, and I don't think we should be neutral and be like, be the BBC on this. On the other hand, this. On the other hand, this, and then you kind of make your own mind up. We do give our steer because I think that's important. Because sometimes people feel like, okay, and where's the punchline? So we do try and give a punchline, but ultimately, look, it's it will come down to the person, and they have to make their own mind up.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that as well. I think a lot of our listeners are going to be, like I mentioned earlier, they're either graduates or they've just started work. And we wanted to understand, especially for individuals that want to get involved in the world of ethical or Islamic finance, kind of what do you see as the key areas which need talent? And how can someone who's maybe embarking on that journey position themselves such that they're going to be well placed in next 2-3 years time?
I think people doing study in this field, both traditional and conventional, is a good idea, because that gives you the raw materials to be able to make good decisions and to think creatively about things. So, like for example, the course that we're both doing. And the other thing I would say is I think there's probably a lot of engineers in the sector already and in the world. So I don't think that's necessarily where there's a gap. But I think product management roles and just operational roles within fintechs, I think those two things are probably quite in high demand in the tech sector generally, but also particularly in Islamic finance.
We've taken zooming out a little bit, looking at a more macro perspective. The mission that you've set yourself to help Muslims kind of level up financially, I think forms a part of a broader need to change or improve society to make society more ethical and more inclusive vis-a-vis the financial system and the monetary system. And I've actually been following some of your posts recently about Silicon Valley Bank, etc.
Yeah.
So in this country and looking globally as well, what do you see are the key challenges and the key things which need to change in order to make the system more ethical and more inclusive?
So much needs to change. I think the banking system as a whole is, it's messed up. I think the banking system is closely and inextricably tied up now with central banks, the government, the treasury. They're all kind of like, when a crisis happens, they're all talking to each other. And that's necessarily so because that's the fabric. Those are the key architects and operators of the financial fabric of, this economy. And to me, so that seems quite odd that you would have, a banking system that is, so reliant upon the government in situations like these, and the government is so reliant on the banking system in situations like these. So I think that, the nature of money and like where money comes from needs to change. I think, banks, many people won't know that banks have the power to effectively create private money because, the coin or the currency that you have, the moment that it enters into the banking system and the bank issues you in return a digital kind of readout on your current account, that in itself is no longer fiat currency. That is bank money, that is private money. And the only reason why that is, worth anything is because people, all of us, accept it as bank money. A similar analogy can be given with, crypto exchanges. The reason why crypto exchanges and, cryptocurrencies can print new tokens and give those out is, limited only insofar as there is demand for those things. And so this is why FTX could print more FTX tokens in the background and collateralize its, and build up its balance sheet using those. And people were like, outraged when FTX was doing this. But the reality is that is actually how the banking system works. Sure, the banking system has more regulation now, and the banking system has controls about how much money you could potentially print. At least indirectly, there are some controls around that. But it's the same system. And the problem with the system is that it's built on a pack of cards. And as soon as there is a loss of confidence between, does the bank actually have enough money to cover me, the pack of cards comes, crashing down. And it needs government bailouts to be able to sustain it. And to me, that just sounds wrong, right? Why is this allowed in the first place? Why are people, willing enough to put money in the banks? Well, the reason is because the government guarantees it up to £85,000. And I feel like that is a complete distortion of what the reality actually is. And the only people that benefit from, because what happens when something like Silicon Valley Bank collapses? Ultimately, somewhere down the line, the taxpayer is paying, picking up the bill for that. In the USA, the FDIC has this reserve fund, which is ultimately capitalized by the Treasury, the US Treasury, or whatever the equivalent is called, and so the taxpayer ultimately picks up the bill for the collapse of this bank, and the bank benefited all these years because of these guarantees that are issued by FDIC, or in our case the FSCS. But when things go wrong, the taxpayer picks up the burden. Doesn't seem right to me. These banks should be forced to collapse, and there should be no guarantees. And people should see it and be like, oh, hang on, but Ibrahim, are you saying that you're going to make banking unsafer? Well, no, I'm just going to make banking more realistic, and just get rid of the blinkers between us and understanding banking for what it actually is. And once you do that, the bankers will come up with products that are appropriate when people can see it for what it is. At the moment, we can't see it for what it is.
That's really interesting. So do you think the whole system of fractional reserve banking needs to be reformed? And do you think the solution for that is cryptocurrency or kind of commodity-backed currency, or is it simply just this splitting banking up from the deposit-taking function to the investing function, which is kind of mixed up at the moment?
Yeah. So I think that's step one, splitting up the deposits and the ultimate investment activity that a bank does. I think that's only fair, right? That, if the average person uses a bank and they think that bank just holds their money and is there for them to take out when they need it, that's not the reality. So we should make it the reality, right? And then they can put in money into a savings account, and that's where there's like an investment activity going on. That is still fractional reserve banking, but that's now linked to the savings account. Now, the next step after that, I think, what is the alternative, and, what do we want to do in terms of where money is created and how that is done? I have certain views. I mean, they're not definitive views on it by any stretch, but I would suggest that you have a public investment bank that is used to issue money, e-money or private money, into the economy, rather than go through banks to do that, because all that does is it helps banks out, and it doesn't actually always necessarily end up in the right place anyway. And then I think so that could be one route. So you have like a public infrastructure bank or something. The other route is CBDCs, so central bank cryptocurrencies. I think they can be very interesting, because what you're doing there is you're getting rid of this interface that is a retail bank and a central bank, because the only people that can bank with a central bank are other banks. Mm-hmm. And we bank with normal banks, and then they've got this strange arbitrage where they can take advantage of things. But if everyone is just directly banking with a central bank, and the central bank is a government controlled entity, then sure, they are screwing us over because it's a bank, but at least the people are in charge of that bank. And so that might be another option. A third option might be that you just tighten up. I mean, I guess those are the two options. And then, practically what that would mean is that you start seeing a lot more money flowing out of bank accounts, because they are understood rightly that they are no longer safe, or they are no longer earning, and they are then plugged into investments. So, in this kind of picture where you have people who have money, people who need money, there are two routes to that. One is the investment route, the other one is the banking route. The banking route, the profits flow back to the bank and stop there, and then you just get the money. With the investment route, the money flows all the way over to people who need it, but then it flows back with the profits to the people who gave the money. And I think you'd increasingly see the investment route as becoming the much more, active bridge between those who have money and those who haven't.
That's a really, really interesting overview. Thank you for that. Should we wrap up with
Yeah, we got some quick fire questions. So we're gonna, bit lighthearted, some quick fire questions,
Let's
and
do
we'll
it.
wrap up with our final one. So my first quick fire question to you is, what is your favorite homemade dish?
Palau, I'd say lamb palau.
Okay. Favorite London Underground line?
Elizabeth line, does that count?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know about that one. That's
your favourite,
I mean, it's
so-
technically a part of the National Rail
Yeah, I know.
system, isn't it? So,
Piccadilly line, maybe.
all right, fine. Are you a day or a night person?
Day.
Okay.
Favorite fiction and non-fiction book?
Favorite fiction, I would say, is something by Charles Dickens. Maybe like a David Copperfield or Nicholas Nickleby, Martin Chuzzlewit, something like that. Favorite non-fiction, there's loads. Why don't we say Anarchy State and Utopia?
And the final one from me is, what is your favorite movie genre, and by extension, what's your favorite film? I guess.
I like regularly to watch things like action thrillers, those kind of things. Favorite film, however, I'm not sure it would necessarily be that. I watched a really interesting one recently called Miss Sloan, Mrs. Sloan, or something like that. It's about this American lobbyist who went up against the gun lobby. It's quite
nice.
interesting. Yeah,
Is that on Netflix or something, or
it was on Amazon.
Amazon? All right.
Yeah.
I might give that a watch. That sounds quite interesting.
It's quite good.
So yeah, I guess final question, just to wrap things off, is what does the future hold for Ibrahim Khan?
The future, who knows?
Yeah.
I think we just want to build up the IFG and Cur8 platforms, reaching as many people as we can across the world. I think this platform slowly evolves over time. Inshallah, I'd like to think into one of the largest Sharia compliant, but generally, hopefully, fund platforms globally. And through that, you get the chance to do lots of good, and pipe money into places where it most needs to be piped into.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you very much, Ibrahim, again for your time, and it's been a really insightful conversation. Definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners will equally learn as much as we have today. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Just want to echo that. I think really unique insights, which I think we've definitely benefited from, and hopefully our listeners can too. So thank you so much for providing the time.
It's been a pleasure.